So my name is Maria Butz, and I'm a project manager with DVDL. We're a cultural agency based in New York. And you'll hear more from my colleague, David Vanderleer, later. And we're very excited to have been working for a few months now, or since April, actually, with the Jessie duPont Fund, as well as our other partners, WXY Studio, Jacksonville, Groundwork Jacksonville, James Lima Planning and Development, as well as our benchmark research partners, Riverfront Parks Now, on this project. So before I hand it over to Mari for an introduction, I just wanted to go over a few kind of just some guidelines for the meeting so that we're set up for success. David, if you can go to the next slide. Great. Yeah, so this is a meeting. It's not a webinar. So if you want to turn on your video, we can see you, but everyone will be muted as they enter the meeting, and please remain muted. There are closed captions available for this meeting. If you look at the Zoom software at the bottom of your screen, it says live transcript, and you can enable closed captioning there. There's also a setting for adjusting the font size. If you choose the speaker view, you'll be able to see whoever is presenting. And we do encourage, which I see is already happening, which is great, to use the chat box during the meeting. You can use it for introducing yourself, which I see that people are doing. And you can also feel free to kind of add comments throughout the meeting in there. We might not kind of respond verbally to all of it, but we definitely do read through the chat after the meeting. So feel free to use that. We'll also have two sections of the meeting for public comments, and we'll use the raise hand function, and you can unmute and speak during that section, but we'll get to that later. And yeah, just be respectful of everyone's time and viewpoints. And that's it. Otherwise, we should be good. If you do have any technical difficulties, we have Lily Weinstein, who's on the call with us from the fund. So feel free to use the chat to directly chat Lily, and she will do her best to help you if you have any issues. And I'm going to hand it over to Mari.
Thank you, Maria. And thank you all for showing up. I see that there are almost 95 participants on this call, which is just just shows you how much engagement we are getting on the issue of activating Jacksonville's riverfront, particularly the downtown riverfront. I am Mari Qureshi, president of the Jessie duPont Fund. We are partnering with all the stakeholders that Maria listed, as well as with the city of Jacksonville, to figure out how we might best create and design a public waterfront in downtown Jacksonville that serves a diverse array of needs, wants, interests for a riverfront for all, by all. And we are very pleased to have been working with Groundwork Jacksonville to reach out to all the different communities, working with WXY to figure out different plans that fit all the needs and wants in this little Tetris block that we call our riverfront, and really to create something that I think doesn't quite yet exist. The St. Johns River is this amazing asset for the city of Jacksonville, and yet we don't have, at least downtown, very many ways for the public to enjoy it. We hope through this process that we might be able to design a lot more. We also hope that if we do decide to build beautiful spaces downtown, that we have an ability to maintain it and that we have an ability to program it. We also believe very much that there is huge potential for great public-private partnerships along the river, that well-designed public spaces will enhance private investment and commerce along the river and create an environment that everyone wants to make a destination. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Vandelier, who is from DVDL. He will take you through the agenda and introduce the rest of the speakers.
Thank you very much, Marian. Good to see a lot of familiar faces and also lots of new people. And great to pick up the conversations that we started with all of you a few weeks ago. We'll probably take 2 hours for the meeting today. The welcome we already passed, so that's all good. We'll give you a series of updates on where the project is currently at. And from there, there's 2 key sections for inputs that we'd like to run by you. The first one is on the social, cultural, and urban planning principles that we've been developing together with stakeholder inputs, with community input, and now, like also especially in this large meeting, hopefully with input from you. And from there, we'll go to the conceptual space plans, basically a test fit of sorts that WXY has been developing with us for the shipyards. This, I'm sure, will be an interesting part of the conversation, so make sure to leave additional or extra enough time for. All in all, this should be an interesting meeting. Lots of people joining still, I see. So let's jump in because there's a lot to go through. Of course, there's always a question like who has been involved on an almost day-to-day basis of this project. And as people that have joined us in the past may remember, there's a series of different stakeholder groups that we've been engaging throughout this process. There's this task force, all people representing different organizations, corporations that we've been especially feeling out on like what would it take to, for instance, influence some of the work that we're developing, so the activation plans. Then there is an activation coalition, which is really big, 25 people or so. And with this group, we're especially thinking through what would it take to develop amazing programs for the Riverfront. Programs for individuals, groups, temporary programs, permanent programs, mobile, stationary, all of it. So exciting to work with this group. And then the last group is a next-gen group, people in their 20s, early 30s, again, representing different organizations in the city. And they've been incredibly helpful trying to make us see like where things may be headed in the coming few decades. So great group to work with. In terms of a few updates, always important because lots has been going on, especially in all the interesting engagement work that Groundwork has been developing with all of us. First of all, what came out of all of those sessions, and there have been walking tours, boat tours, meetings that Groundwork organized, and as you know, there's also a survey that Maria will tell you about more about in a minute. What we've been hearing so far is quite interesting, and perhaps some of this is not surprising to you at all. But first of all, a lot of people are asking for more water access, and of course also more water-related activities. Across the board, people are looking for more family-friendly, inclusive, but also diverse and accessible and affordable types of programming along the river. And in some cases, it also means like very particular programs that you're looking for to come back, like for instance, the Jazz Festival, and also other events that really promoted inclusivity. And then, of course, especially in outdoor spaces, there's always such a big opportunity for educational work, but it doesn't always happen. You have a rich history in Jacksonville, and long and interesting history, so it would be good to loop that into the riverfront development more. And of course, also think through like what is the science of riverfronts and water moving forward in the next few decades. And then very importantly, of course, you do not always want to pay for something, right? It's, that you want to visit. It would be wonderful to have a lot of free and low cost events that do not happen sporadically throughout the year, but that happen on an ongoing basis with set schedules that you can understand and like can easily figure out what to go for, what to potentially skip. We're using all this information to feed into the activation plan that we're currently developing. You'll be seeing more of that in the coming meeting. which I believe is in October. In terms of other updates, of course, thinking around the riverfront also means thinking about how to fund the activation plan for the riverfront. Things do not just happen on a whim most of the time. You need to seriously plan for things and also seriously fund things. For this reason, we've engaged James Lima and partners, who Maria mentioned earlier, to work with us on funding analysis for the whole project. And they will be thinking through what is also the economic significance of an active downtown riverfront. Because of course you want to be sure it's a great place to go to, but it would also be amazing if it had a positive economic impact on the city. Then we're thinking through like what are the high-level funding strategies for these activation plans. And in that process, we're looking, of course, at national case studies that give us an indication of like what to do, what not to do. But we're also be spending quite serious time on thinking through like what are public as well as private funding sources for this work, especially on the activation side. So interesting what is all going on there. Then I already mentioned the survey. The survey, as you know, has been, or many of you know probably, has been up for the last weeks in the city. Maria will talk you through some preliminary outcomes and next steps for that. So Maria, over to you for that.
Sure. Yeah. And first I can just give you can go back to that slide real quick. So just a short update on, so the goal, of course, of this project is an activation plan for the downtown riverfront. And so all the input that we are getting through the community meetings, the stakeholder meetings, sorry, and the programs that Groundwork Jacksonville has been running, as well as the stakeholder meetings, is of course all input for the activation plan, and we're pretty far along in that work. As we've mentioned a few times already, we've also been doing quite an extensive work on waterfront benchmark on cities around the country and the world with waterfront developments that we've been looking at, as well as forecasting research on really like where's the future headed for public space and how will public space be used 10, 20 years from now, and especially how does that relate to waterfronts. You'll hear more about the social, cultural, and urban design principles that we have developed together with WXY later, and as well as the shipyards plans that we have mentioned a few times. The conceptual space plans for the shipyards property that has been developed by WXY and DVDL has been presented by Lori Boyer, and Lori Boyer, who's the CEO of the Downtown Investment Authority, presented the principle as well as the shipyards plans at the Retail Enhancement and Property Disposition Committee, as well as to the full DIA board at the end of June and July 7. As part of the Iguana development application. And the plans generally were very well received by members of the board and the public at large. Just as an update, the board unanimously recommended the approval of the Iguana development application, with the understanding that a world-class park in line with what you will see in the conceptual space plans by the DVDL Fund would take shape on Hogan's Creek West should the disposition of Kids Campus take place. So those are just an update on where we are with the shipyards plans, and we will walk you through those in a minute. And then we can go to the survey. So hopefully you all have seen this out there, and hopefully you've all completed the survey. But for the past month, we've had this open. And the goal of this survey is really to, first of all, understand how people are using the downtown riverfront spaces today, and how they would like to use them in the future, as well as get an understanding of how people get around and what they think are lacking downtown. And we've had a really good amount of responses so far. So we have almost 3,000 responses for the survey. The survey has been closed to the general public, but we are still doing some targeted outreach for underrepresented groups in the survey. And so we did want to show you guys just a few results. This is not the full analysis of the survey, but just to see a little bit what we've been hearing. So in this question, we ask how often people visit different spaces downtown. As you can see, the South Bank, Friendship Fountain, which is also on the South Bank, as well as the North Bank Riverwalk and the former landing side, looks to be the most visited spaces from our respondents, with the Sydney Geffen Park and Bergman Plaza and the Corkscrew Park and Met Park as well being less visited. And of course, generally, I would say we see kind of a low usage of these spaces. So even for the ones that are used the most, it's around 20–30% for people responding often or sometimes. And of course, that's one of the things we want to change, right? We want all these spaces to be highly used by the community. And it will be interesting also to see how these numbers kind of change, right, in the coming years when different plans and developments and activations take place. In the next 3 slides, you'll see we've asked about what kind of activities people do downtown. Some of the ones that was responded the most in this one was really like spending time with family or with friends or by yourself on the river, and also visiting restaurants and bars. I would say the more like mundane activities like shopping, going to the market or going to the dentist, and then also sightseeing is rated lower in terms of usage. And so that is kind of interesting just in terms of things we might also want to consider as a place for on the river. For the next one, we asked about specifically about recreation and exercise activities. And we see that most people use the riverfront for things like running and walking, fitness, tai chi, that kind of stuff, but also just enjoying green space and being outside. Maybe a little bit surprising, not as many people said they used the riverfront for picnicking or biking or walking their dog, which are some of the things that we've heard from a lot of people that they would like to do on the riverfront, which may indicate that these type of activities are not well supported or kind of available today. And then we asked about events on the riverfront. And here we see that sports events and cultural events are what people use the riverfront for the most. Not a lot of people go to the river for religious events or community events or educational events or political events. And I think that's definitely something that we want to keep in mind, that we think, these type of activities take place in a lot of neighborhoods currently, but it would be interesting to think through, could some of these also take place on the river, and what would that look like? And then finally, we asked people how they get around and how they primarily get to the downtown riverfront. And probably not very surprisingly to most of you, that 87% said that they go by car, and only 20% by foot or bike, and only 4% said that they go by public transportation, which is very low. So I think we do want to think through, what are alternative ways. I know that people are concerned about parking, and people will continue to use their cars for sure. But we do want to think if there are other ways we can get people to the river and make it convenient and a comfortable way to get there. And on the last one I'm going to show you, we asked if the river was fully connected by trails and water access and public transportation, how would you prefer to get around on the river? And as you can see, people would want to walk or bike, and also would very much like to use water transportation. And so I think thinking through how to make that accessible and affordable is going to be really important going forward. So those are just some high level results, and we will of course get you a lot more information when we finally close the survey down.
Very good. Thank you, Maria. What we'll do with the survey, it will become a report of sorts that will go onto the websites as we've been doing with other materials. So like some of the items that you will be seeing about in the meeting today, for instance, the shipyard plans, the principles that we're about to present, those already live on the website. What is not on the website yet, but what will be entering the website in the coming weeks is research that we've been doing about like where generally are things headed culturally. So forecasting research on public space related issues, but also an initial benchmark and especially focused on activation schemes as well as design issues from different cities. What we've been doing is on the benchmark piece of this work, we've been collaborating with Riverfront Parks now. It's been a very pleasant collaboration. A lot of work has been moved by the group, and we've been impressed by that. The forecasting work is happening on our side, and for the process of the points of the meeting today, we're combining a snapshot of this work and knowing that there will be a ton more that is getting produced in the coming weeks. In the sense of that, what a ton of work will be, we're looking at these types of topics on the forecasting side, so ranging from resiliency items, food items, as we'll be presenting today. It's also thinking through like, what does it mean to be a community member, community ownership, thinking through innovation and so on. Many of these topics will not be presented today, but will be available in the next weeks. In terms of the benchmarking work that we did with Riverfront Parks now, is we've looked together at 27 cities in 7 countries. In all those cities, we look particularly for cities with rivers, canals, lakes, and ocean sides. And what we've been doing here is making sure that we're not only large parks or large green spaces, but also generally dense urban developments, less dense developments, and so on. For the research parameters, we said it's important to think about programs and activities, but also cost and governance, design and green space ratio. So this will be interesting over the coming weeks. We'll be issuing this step by step also on social media because there's just so much good stuff out there. And honestly, I think it could make a nice travel list for the coming years now that travel is easier again. These are the cities that we looked at. Of course, all of you will say like, there's at least 1 or 2 cities that we could have added. Yes, of course, there's always more. But collectively between Riverfront Parks now and us, we felt like this was giving a good sense of like where things are headed and what can be learned. In terms of a series of the topics, and as I said, I'm combining here for the sake of the meeting between some of the forecasting work and some of the benchmarking work that we're developing. But of course, we're living in really interesting times. That is clear on many levels. Climate will be a conversation that will not be leaving us in the coming years. We're seeing this on a day-to-day basis, from rising sea water levels to drought issues in other places around the country. And of course, we need to start adapting to this. The interesting thing is that it's causing a surprising, or perhaps not surprising, amount of anxiety among people. And for instance, in the US, 40% of Americans is feeling disgusted. I found the interesting word, but helpless is a very logical word, right? Knowing that there's so much change happening and like what to do with that. Of course, it's important to think through like how could this be combated? How do we adapt to all of this? And in order to do so, social connections, but also hands-on learning about these changes that are about to rush over us if they haven't already, will be increasingly important. This, of course, also has an impact on how we're thinking about public spaces, green spaces. And it will be very important to realize that like change can really start in each of our backyards. We need to think through like what is the native flora and fauna in areas that we live in. How do we deal with our water, and how can we take care of all of this much better? Generally, what we see is it will also be quite important to think through really good facilities that stimulate innovation and education, especially when we're thinking through waterproofing our cities or future-proofing our cities, especially the riverfronts and the waterfronts. In some cities, this is happening in really interesting ways already. You know, some of these in the area, and actually my hometown, Rotterdam, here on the bottom right, is also doing some interesting work there. What this will also mean for spaces that we're developing collectively in different places around the world is that we need to look at much more flexibility in these places. Not everything can be as solid, as big, as grand as we perhaps wanted things in the past, but we need to be sure that we're setting things up for extreme weather events. The interesting thing when you're talking about resiliency these days, of course, resiliency is largely used to talk about climate resiliency, but resiliency, as probably many of you know, is actually a term that is coming out of psychology. So it's embedded, steeply embedded in, or deeply embedded in the social sciences. And it's actually also interesting to look at like the social infrastructure that we have in our cities and the value that we could be placing on those, thinking through like, okay, what is actually the social infrastructure? How can we make this more resilient? And is there actually a resiliency beyond the bridges and roads infrastructure, climate infrastructure that we're thinking about these days on a probably ongoing basis? But what do we do to make sure that there's also good and deep connections socially? Of course, this has a big impact on how we're looking at the Riverfront activation plan. The great thing is that as long as there's solid social resiliency in places, you're also set up for problems that may arise. I was very happy to see that like Elsa, did create some chaos, of course, for you all, but perhaps, or luckily, not as much as could have been expected. In events like this, having that connection between each other can be incredibly important. Looking at that also means, of course, both on the climate resiliency side as well as on the social resiliency side, that this will have an impact on how we're looking at the riverfront. You will probably recognize some of these examples coming from the cities that I showed you earlier. But of course, in Jacksonville, it will be increasingly important that in order to hang out, you need to be able to cool off. Things will be getting hotter, and it will be important to have spaces in the shade, spaces that are calm, and that you could linger in pleasantly. This could mean more trees. Definitely would propose having many more trees on the riverfront, but would also mean thinking around all types of shading structures, but also thinking around activities that are possible to do even when it's hot, and promoting those in perhaps different ways. Especially water activities, of course, are great there. You're already doing quite a bit of that, but it could be lots more. Especially if it's done safely, because I'm well aware that the river is not always a safe place, especially in the widest part of the river. But the river is soothing and cooling and fun. So yeah, let's really look at what is also there, the potential educational usage over the coming years. So what we're looking at there is, for instance, on the design side, beyond activities such as you see them here and lots of other things to come, it's like, could it be floating islands that could get you onto the river more? Could it be all types of community hubs? Could it be markets and classrooms with all types of activities around the water, on the water, and so on? Different topic, but an important topic also, especially when looking at how to activate the riverfront, is looking at things that we do on a day-to-day basis, and that's all in all, I think pretty much all of us like doing, such as eating. What does food mean for the city? What does food mean potentially for the waterfront? And of course, food is going through big transition globally globally also. As we see, like, it's not necessarily possible or even desirable to fully rely on global supply chains. We cannot keep doing that for food. So it will be increasingly important to think about what can you supply and produce and supply within the region. So thinking around local food cultures so that we can really be sure that we develop a much healthier community on all levels. And of course, if this is done well, you don't want to forget about amazing traditions with foods, but combine those with interesting innovation. And we see this happening in many places. Of course, this will have an impact on how we're thinking about space on the riverfront and how we're thinking about activities. And what we saw, and it was mentioned earlier, is that it's increasingly important to make sure that things are not very, like things need to be, there needs to be a big variety of food options also. There needs to be affordable food options. And you don't want to eat foods in spaces that you don't want to be in, right? You want to be able to bring your food, purchase foods, but also think through, like, should I perhaps cook foods together that, with people that you bring to the riverfront? And that will be exciting. We'll be bringing lots of new activity to the riverfront, hopefully moving forward. These are a few snapshots of the research that we're currently working through, partially with the benchmark research that we did together with Riverfront Parks now, and partially with the larger global research that we're bringing to the table. And as I said, like, this will all be moving into the activation plan, so there will be one of the tools that we're using to think through, like, what will be ending up in the activation plan, as will be the many conversations that we're having at the moment with all of you. The next section of the meeting today, we would like to focus on a series of principles. We've been developing these in very close collaboration between WXY, so the architects, landscape architects, working on the project. And you will see Claire in a minute presenting the second set of these principles, and us. And there's two sets of principles. There is the planning principles, and you will see those presented by Claire. And then there's a series of social and cultural principles that I will be presenting you now. Each of these principles that you will be seeing, and there's 10 of them, are part of a much larger package. And it's actually interesting. I can show you one example of this. They each come with a checklist. So for instance, the first principle, and I will run you through all of them in a minute, is we want to be sure that the riverfront is welcoming and accessible to all. But of course, this means that it should not be fully open to interpretation, what welcoming and accessible means. So for that reason, we've developed a checklist, and there's 5 points roughly for each of these principles that I will be showing you. And how we see these principles and their checklists is that they become a major touch point for any development and any activity that hopefully gets created in the coming years for the riverfront. So they become a guiding set of principles, and in conversations with you, we'd like to be able to refine these principles. A few weeks ago, we ran them through the conversations with the different stakeholder groups when we were in Jacksonville. So interesting conversations. We've been also be running them through community sessions with groundwork, Jacksonville already. And today it's good to get your eyes on them also. In order not to take up basically until midnight, because this could take forever, if I talk you through like all these items, is what we've decided is to run you through the high level of each of these. And then from there, make sure that we speak or we send you to the website, because on the website you will see all the checklists, and you can definitely click through that. It's also a way, of course, to get you to the website and click around a little there. So on the social and cultural principles, very straightforward. We want to be sure that the riverfront and the activities on the riverfront become welcoming and accessible to all. And that means that they're open to people from different cultures, neighborhoods, and histories, that things are affordable, to repeat that item again, that information is available in a variety of languages, and that there's also different ways of getting to the river. So yes, car, but also other options would be great. And ideally that there's different things happening and options for basically 24/7 and ideally 365 around the year. The second principle, as you see here in that second item, is focused on diversity of audience and experience. And we want to be sure that there's a broad range of uses and types of spaces for the different and diverse interests and of course diverse demographics in the city. It's always a missed opportunity, I find, if there's a lot of activation developed, but then there's no interaction between different groups. So it would also be great if there is a way to look at the activation plan, look at the riverfront and say, like, what are options for people to come together here and actually interact with each other. Of course, this means that you need to look at what is a level of comfort that everybody has, what is visual intrigue, what is nature, but also be sure that there's actually, again, affordable programming and educational opportunities. Third item is flexibility, and this becomes increasingly important in the coming decades. We cannot keep building as we have been doing perhaps in the last few decades. So it will be really important to think through, like, how do we develop activities and activation schemes that allow for flexibility and change. So that means, of course, like thinking through the formal, the informal, the small, the medium, and the large activities. But it also means that there needs to be long-term planning, flexibility, and resiliency in all these schemes that will be developed. The interesting thing with thinking through riverfront plans, public space plans, in general urban planning, is that there is often, especially for public spaces, a big focus on elements of fun. Being able to hang out, have a good time. There's nothing wrong with that. It's actually very important that we all do that. But it's also very important that there is a sense of functionality next to that sense of fun. So we'd like to combine that in the riverfront activation schemes. So that means thinking through, for instance, could the riverfront activation plans be used to think about job opportunities, about education, access to fresh produce, services such as bike repairs, package pickup, God knows, but there's so many opportunities there. So it'll be interesting to develop that. And then last but not least, in the social and cultural principles section is, of course, the promoting of wellness. This is a buzzword the last few years, and not for unsurprising reasons. And it will be increasingly important to think through, like, how can we connect residents not only together, but also to exercise, recreation, relaxation, but also very importantly, a sense of play. And especially in that last section, play, it's also important, as you see here in the image all the way on the right, to think around, like, are there natural features or semi-natural, of course, as you see in the image here, that could help promote mental health, physical health, and so on. So this is a snapshot of the public space principles, and Claire will jump over now to the planning principles. And as I said, together we're hoping that these become like a rule book, a guiding set of principles for everything activation and planning on the riverfront in Jacksonville. So Claire, over to you, and just let me know if you want to jump over to the next slide.
Yeah, next slide, please. Great. As David mentioned, there was a real opportunity in all of this work leading by engagement to develop principles, social and cultural, and then now some urban planning principles that came out of that are very specific to Jacksonville itself and to the riverfront, but also to many of the previous plans and ideas that we got a chance to review in preparing for this. And so again, there's a handful, in this case 5, of some, we think, issues that any riverfront plan will need to excel in. And I'll go through them kind of broad base. So the first one is ecology. And again, David talked a lot about emerging kind of both, yes, fears, but also opportunities to look at the ecology in cities specifically, but what rivers and lakes and buildings can all do. And so ecology is something that is always talked about when it comes to parks, but is also very much, you have a real river system here, you had an estuary. Ecology is a big opportunity to have a multi-layered approach to water, air, and climate. And this leads to really, what are some of the other urban design or planning drivers of any park plan? And they tend to be continuity. And what are the things that connect you to other things? And sometimes that's called a path, sometimes that's called a promenade, sometimes that's called a beach, sometimes that's called a marina, sometimes that's called a road or a bike path. So what's particularly important when resiliency is at issue, when flooding, when climate events, when everyday events are at issue, is really these layers of parks. So how does the upland in yellow layer, the streets of the city, how does that connect to another layer, which is protecting investments, as in raising the grade in most cases? Now we have to look at buildings and places that are a bit higher, moving into this century. And then again, the promenades and esplanades that make waterfronts accessible to people. We looked at that accessibility issue. And then the third one is also particular to, I think, great cities that connect to their waterfronts, which is, we all want to look down, whether it's a street or from a viewpoint, and see something we want to go to. And that's really where this frame view comes in. And that can be interpreted in many ways. Sometimes it's actually the quality of the street, and sometimes it's what you see down the street. Okay, so that's what frame view corridors we define as. So partially it's what's in the view, and partially it's the quality of the corridor. And then variety, and maybe variety could be seen as, in urban design terms, like flexibility, but it's also about quality and character. And so in many places that people feel close to, they feel like they're of a place, have a variety of types of spaces, buildings, and treatments. And then finally, something we're calling great streets is really connects downtown to its waterfront on both sides, which is what makes a great street, and how do we treat streets like they're important experiences along every riverfront. And I think that's it, unless you want me to go quickly into some of the detail, David.
I think that is good. I don't think we need to go into the detail, but also for this section, so for the public realm principles and planning side of things, there's a checklist for each of these that you find in the link that Maria put in the chat.
Yep. And so it's really worth, in many cases, these checklists, we've really been talking through with people in all the different sessions to try and look at all the aspects of, let's say, ecology, both from the health of the water, the health of plant life, but from the public health. What is it and from an education perspective. So really what the urban planning principles should do is bring the social and cultural principles into focus in terms of actualizing those principles and allowing the events to happen in spaces, but also allowing those spaces in every day when people even go by themselves to perform relative to these categories. Okay. Great.
With that, we're jumping over to Maria. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, thank you both. So yeah, we have time now for some comments or questions about these principles. We do have a few people that we've asked to kind of kick it off. So I hope that they're on and that I can find them here. But so first, I would like to see if Selena Mendez, who's an environmental activist and a community member of North Riverside in northern Jacksonville. If Selena, if you're on, and if you want to talk just a little bit about generally some concerns or needs of your community and how these principles kind of address some of those.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. My need is about the streets, the waterfront public realm principles when it comes to Great Street. I grew up in North Riverside on right there on McCoy Creek. So I know that groundworks is coming through to revitalize the creek and everything. But right now over in Riverside, we do have a lot of flooding. So I want to know what can be done to prevent a lot of this flooding so we can have these great streets.
Claire, do you want to take us?
Well, specific, I mean, I think that's exactly the point you're making, is that it's not one or the other, that
Okay.
the riverfront and the streets both have to perform well for people, and not when something floods, it's number one unhealthy, but it's also a barrier to getting there. And it also makes the maintenance over time of people's buildings and homes almost impossible, right? So the efforts in the creeks are absolutely going to help a certain amount with flooding, but there's a big role for streets, for how you develop parks to actually work together as a system. So Selena, I really appreciate you bringing it up, because in many cases, it's usually presented as though you have to choose one or another. And I think you're making the clear point that there shouldn't be a choice between the two. They both have to happen.
Yes, exactly. Thank you so much.
Great.
Great. And the Susan Kevin from Riverfront Parks Now, and also board president of Jacksonville. Susan, are you online?
I am online, Maria. Thank you so much. And just, I really wanted to say how much we appreciate you and WXY and your whole group for asking so many questions, coming down with such an open mind, and asking us to think about what we want. I live in the South Side, and we have the South Bank River Walk that is a lovely walk, but it is over the river because no public space was ever set aside for the public on the South Side except for Friendship Park. And so you have when you go down the South Side River Walk, you have a wall of tall buildings and a fence, keeping you away from these tall buildings. You have garages, and you have a feeling that you're not welcome. You were staying away, no trespassing. So it's an unfortunate thing because there's no public restroom or a place to get a cup of coffee or a tree to sit under. So we feel like we squandered a chance on our South Side, and maybe the North Side is the time to make the riverfront accessible to people and welcoming. And we've Riverfront Parks now all over the country at cities that have public parks. And the thing that has struck me about that is that the city's desire for the public to have access to the water. And what can they do? Attract people to the water, to bring people to the waterfront downtown? How can they do it? San Diego is a city that, as we compare ourselves to, and they have a 1,200-acre Balboa Park downtown. It's an urban park with museums and restaurants and all kinds of stuff. But they have just built a 60-acre riverfront park right on water that is for the public. It is blocks long, fountains where children can play, but people can walk, and they have a botanical garden area. It is a destination that if people come to San Diego to see this, and I think the surprise to all of us has been when we looked at all these cities that have invested in their public spaces, public spaces for the public, that the development surrounds it, and the surrounding space is very valuable. And cities all over the country have been surprised at how much they have benefited economically by having a beautiful, appealing space. So and a place that is resilient to obvious water rising. So thank you for opening our eyes, you guys, for making us really think. And now I think it's up to us to do what is been told by local people. You have to build a wall of support and tell your city councilmen and your leaders this: we want our public space to be used by the public. We're not talking private space. Berkman too can build, another condo. But our public space should be for the public who enjoy the riverfront. It's the last chance we get. There's no more public space in Jacksonville available. Thank you so much, Maria.
Thank you, Susan. Those were the great comments. And actually, to piggyback on one of them, you're talking about the impact on real estate development, right? So I agree that it can be a very positive impact on the financial status of the city. I do think it's important, though, in those processes to also think through and avoid the displacement. So you want to be sure that, like, by making some land more interesting and valuable, perhaps for investment in the long run, that communities get displaced. So it's a very important thing in all of this work. We want to be sure that the riverfront is accessible to all, but also that it doesn't lead to unnecessary displacement.
Great, thank you. And so I have one more person that I'm going to call on, but if for everyone else on the line, if you would like to add a comment on the principles or more broadly, or have questions, you can use the raised hand function and we will get to a few of you. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a reactions tab. And when you click that, there should be an option to raise your hand. So yeah, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll call on you in just a second. But first I want to see if we have Zachary Taylor on the line. Zachary is a realtor with Premier Coast Realty.
Yes, I'm here. So my name's Zach Taylor. I'm a third generation resident of Durkeeville. And I think that this plan for the riverfront is really important, not just for downtown, but for the entire city as a whole. And I think that one of the keys to making this public space really a great space is accessibility, especially accessibility to the people in the surrounding neighborhoods like Durkeeville, Springfield, and the East Side. I think one of the things that's really important are making sure that things like there's multiple bus stops along the frontage of the park for people who may not have cars, which a lot of people in my neighborhood are transit dependent, and also making sure that there's things like safe bike parking, places if people want to ride scooters or however else that they would access these parks, make sure that that's there. Important thing also is 24/7 access. There's people that like to use these spaces at various different times, whether that be for, going late at night for meditation, going during the day to hang out with friends, just making sure that this space is open at all times of the day throughout the year for people of however they would like to use it. Another thing that's really important to me and for people in my neighborhood is that ensuring that the focus on safety within this park doesn't lead to over policing and over, looking at people really suspiciously as you're trying to get that focus on safety, just making sure that people do feel comfortable coming to this park, especially with having the jail right across the street from it. And that's really important. Another thing that's really important is having space for teenagers such as myself. I'm 19 years old, and we do have some parks in Jacksonville, but there's not really any really good places for people, teenagers specifically, to go, whether that be after school or during the summer. So just having a place where teenagers can go do various activities, whether playing sports, just hanging out with friends, getting a bite to eat, enjoying the riverfront. That is really important. And also, I think it's also really important to have space for fishing and shrimping along the river. That is a really important industry for the surrounding areas, such as the East Side, Durkeeville, and that's a lot of people's livelihoods. And currently downtown, there's not many places to go in order to do that. Most of the Riverwalk is you're not allowed to fish there. And so I think that that's really important, and that can really be a boon for downtown as well, especially including vendor space so people can go and sell, at a market type place to do that. And I really do think it's important to have vendor space and to have a diversity of vendors and food options there. That's really important. But overall, I think this is a really important project for the community, and I'm really excited to see it move forward. Thank you.
Zach, thanks so much for jumping in. And can I ask you a question? Is it a gaming chair?
Yeah, it is a gaming chair. Got it from my stepdad.
Exactly, I thought it was. And then the question to you would be, is like, what would it take to get you gaming online, but on the riverfront?
Honestly, it wouldn't take much. I love going down to the water. I love going down to the riverfront. So something like that would be really cool. I'd love to do it.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I see just one hand raised right now, but Thomas Martin, if you want to go ahead and pose a question or a comment. Let's see if.
Okay, I'm Thomas Martin. I live on the west side, the southwest side, in the Argyle Forest area. And so what's going on downtown seems to be closed, and only, the people in the immediate areas seem to be involved in this. It was interesting. I just got on the 9th, I got a email from the Cathedral District describing a number of things going on, including this event today. And that's why I called. Now, I'm also a member of the Southwest CPAC, and we have no idea, never anything is ever brought up to what's going on downtown. And the other is, I'm also a member of the North Florida Transportation Planning Organization Citizens Advisory Committee. And very little discussion is done with transportation projects, especially within the city of Jacksonville. A number of years, I guess in 2016, there was a political rally at the landing, and also some kind of a walk for something at the landing at the same time. And everybody was asked to park over by the convention center and take the Skyway over. Well, everybody did, except one problem. The Skyway didn't have the capacity to handle everybody. And that's a big issue. And that's because the JTA didn't run enough vehicles frequently enough and to handle all the traffic. And so they're not very attuned to what's going on in the community. I was also interested in what's Sean Kahn, his stuff his plans down at the ball down by the stadium doesn't seem to match the little picture I have of the neighborhood. So I was wondering what's going on there. And then I noticed that Fort Lauderdale is developing a subway to take people to the beach. So I was just wondering, maybe we should look at that too, because my biggest thing is about transportation. For me to go to downtown, it takes a half hour to drive there. If I want to take a bus, who knows? First off, it's about 4 miles to get to the first bus, and then it takes another hour to go from there to the bus station downtown. So it's, people outside the downtown area are not included in any of this discussion, and it really needs to be for everybody. And so thank you. Turn my mic.
That's of course right at the moment when there's a ambulance driving by here. Sorry for the background noise. Thomas, thank you for your points. I think they're all important. When we started this project, and Mari may want to speak to this also, but of course you always want to set up some parameters, right? Especially on what the area is that you're looking at. So this became a project focused on the downtown riverfront, but also always with the understanding that Jacksonville is bigger than downtown and bigger than the downtown riverfront. So always an interest in like thinking beyond that, and is there scalability of both the activation plan as well as the design recommendations that WXY will be making. So I think that's very important. And in terms of transportation, I know that this is one of Claire's favorite topics. So I'm going to pass that one over to Claire.
Actually, I'm going to let David Vega, who's our project manager and a transportation expert, talk a little bit about the issues that we heard, which were really interesting. Mr. Martin, David, do you want to jump in, Vega?
Sure. Yeah, and I will say it's a great question, and we've been kind of awestruck in some ways just by the sheer size of Jacksonville, and I think that's a particular challenge here in terms of thinking about access to the downtown, the riverfront from other areas that people might be coming from. We've been looking at transportation on a number of different levels, and I think it really ranges in spectrum from somebody who wants to come on foot to the riverfront and what that experience looks like to someone that's coming by bike, e-bike, or scooter, to the experience of actually driving a car to the riverfront. And so as part of that, we've also really been looking at how we can better connect the riverfront by bus, by water taxi, and by skyway. And we think that there are some kind of basic improvements to the quality of all of those systems and how they could potentially interface with the larger design process and larger kind of vision for the shipyards. One of the things that we found to be really successful is thinking about transportation planning and about transportation solutions, not just as sort of something that needs to address kind of peak flows and peak times, but also has a really strategic management plan at sort of specific times when there's going to be high amounts of usage. So the idea of having water access or water taxis, which have been really popular on weekends when parks may have a higher amount of use, or during games when they have a higher amount of use. Thinking about a really smart integrated parking management plan that can think not only about parking and access at the riverfront directly, but also existing parking facilities within the downtown, within adjacent lots and surrounding areas where there may be an opportunity to actually bus people from those facilities to the riverfront, or have a kind of experience where they're walking or scootering directly to the riverfront. The other thing that we've been really considering very closely is this kind of larger opportunity of better connecting the riverfront, both by public transit, bus specifically, and for pedestrians. And we think that really ensuring that this is a pedestrian priority plan, one that thinks not only about the pedestrian experience coming from a neighborhood to the north or from downtown to the west, but also the experience of a pedestrian that's leaving their car and walking to a facility. At the end of the day, everybody that's using the riverfront is going to have a pedestrian experience, and we think that that's critical. Part of our kind of fact finding around this is really around understanding in a more granular way what those different experiences look like, and ensuring that our design process and parameters considers not just the riverfront as something that's isolated, but the threads that go to different ways that people are going to be really accessing it. Luckily, we've seen transportation planning evolve into a field that has so many more options, whether that's scooter or e-bike or bike share, or circulator buses, or BRT. So there are a lot of tools in our toolkit there, and we really look forward to kind of working with you and working with others involved in transportation planning to kind of make sure that we're thinking about that from a variety of different angles.
Thank you, David. So I think we have time for just one more comment, and I see one more raised hand, so that checks out. So Greer Gillis, if you want to go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for allowing me to comment. And Mr. Martin, good to see you this afternoon, sir. Thank you very much for your comment as well. I'm coming in not just as a community person, but also as someone who works for the JTA. And I am happy to hear the discussion around the connections to the riverfront, really focusing on the variety of modes, pedestrian, which is so important and a priority to this, but also public transportation, because as we see our community grow, the last thing I think all of us want is traffic congestion in any way, shape, or form, taking away from the beauty that we're looking for in the downtown area, and especially around the riverfront. I think one of the things I wanted to definitely make sure, and David, I appreciate the fact that you're looking at a very strategic thought process, all encompassing on the variety of transportation modes that will be coming. We are looking at that as well at the JTA, and I think all of you. I'm sorry. Okay. I'll cut this very short. One of the things we're looking at as we transform out of our Skyway, because I hear that is still an effort, but it's still something that's still being used downtown. We want to expand on that, which is why we're going to the ultimate urban circulator with our autonomous vehicle transit system. But one of the things I want us to all to just keep in mind that we want to make sure that all the different modes of transportation connects to not just the riverfront, but connects to even the outerlying urban core neighborhoods, and making sure that there's access to and from the riverfront, but especially the needs of our community, and how we can work with you all to be able to do that, starting with the foundation of our ultimate urban circulator. So thank you.
Thank you. So I do see we have Stephanie, I think you had your hand raised earlier and I see it up again. So just a few minutes more, we have time for some comments from you as well.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to thank you for this outstanding work. I looked through the slides a couple weeks ago and was just thrilled to see the things that I want to see reflected in these design principles. I left in the comment a note about view. And I think that's really important. A lot of downtown Jacksonville and the amenities there are actually very walkable, but they don't present as walkable. You can't see where to go. It's not connected. It doesn't feel inviting to pedestrians. The traffic moves quickly. And so it sends a message that this is not a place for pedestrians. So I love that design principle. I just wanted to thank you overall for this great work. I work at the Jessie, and I could be on the waterfront all the time. I do go there occasionally to walk, but the structure just isn't present to support that kind of activity. So I just wanted to say I love the design principles. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you all. Thank you so much. So we are going to move on to the second portion, and there will be another round of public comments. So remember your questions. So Claire, if you want to go ahead on the space plan.
Great. So thanks, everyone. I know that I've seen in the chat all sorts of questions. And what this, I'm going to represent the work that has been posted and public, and want to say that it really, this was work that we wanted to do quickly in order to address the fact that there was a proposal for the shipyards, to not lose the opportunity of all the work that the advisory groups, everyone was doing on getting some larger principles and test them. So what you're seeing in terms of the specifics is very much a test of those principles and where the constraints and opportunities are. So let's go to the next slide. Very much kind of, again, part of the benchmarking, part of working on social and cultural principles and the planning principles is to be able to look around at work all over the nation, the world, in Florida, and ask what are the great spaces that people want to go to that not only are wonderful, but they solve some of the issues about accessibility, about flexibility, about having having real attractors, about places teenagers want to hang out in, and places people that are of older generations feel as theirs, feel comfortable in. And some of the things that came up are issues involving topography. You know, it's very flat, many of the spaces today along the riverfront. And that the topography, and also then amphitheaters and other ways to see performances. And then things that are very specific to rivers themselves. You can only have on a river, right? You know, like floating walkways, pools, which in many cities, not just Paris, but in even smaller cities, people want to learn how to swim. Swimming is an important public health and safety issue for people, but it's also a great way to get people close to the issue of water quality. If they can swim in or near a river, they start to care about the river more. Bridges. Jacksonville is a city of bridges. We were admiring many of them, actually, and lighting them is really beautiful. And there is an opportunity for kind of structures and bridges to be thematically continue to be important on the river. And then finally, piers. I mean, the shipyard district itself was a district of piers. And okay, to the next slide. So those are some of the inspirations. Other inspirations were other parks that have started to prove the case for, you know, urban parks being a way to create resilient, in this case, in Queens, Hunters Point South, themselves being really helping to protect parts of cities, especially parks in the case of this one that was built on landfill, but include bringing back coastal wetlands. They include promontories for people to hang out and have a view, and multiple paths. So that really kind of speaks to that planning principle of many different choices for paths and ecology. Next one. Chattanooga is also a really interesting example of a river park that was done in multiple phases, but really the drama of, just like the drama of the creeks coming into the riverfront, and those opportunities for fishing piers, for other kinds of just access to the water, and again, for bridging over some more vulnerable parts of the water where there might be kayak launches or more of a estuary condition. Again, those opportunities for waterfronts having many, many levels really increases the amount of access for different activities. And so finally, I just wanted to end on, as important as riverfront parks are, riverfront parks that are well loved can also include active commercial areas for people to eat, to shop, to have entrepreneurial activities, to provide jobs for people. And so I wanted to put in the efforts in Southwest Washington, D.C., which has really become an attractor for neighborhoods all over Washington, D.C. to come be part of a kind of marina river culture there. And again, has launched some new businesses and new opportunities. So next, and it's with really all of these in mind that we've started, again, the purpose in this engagement plan is to have a framework and a toolkit that's larger than the shipyard plan. And the shipyard is in a way a test to understand many of the issues. So we started with a toolkit that really covers the shipyard, but we hope beyond, including different types of marinas, kinds of pools and floating, whether floating bridges, floating islands. These are things that can only happen next to water. Activity piers, there's some very successful examples of that. Again, amphitheaters that relate to a performance being really, you look out to the river at performers. And so you can enjoy the view and enjoy the performance. And I want to emphasize fishing piers, and I want to invest the importance in parks of having topography and landforms. Number one, for not only for the health of the trees and planting, but really different microclimates and ecosystems and planting require variations in soil conditions and shade. So I think variety is really important here. Okay, then finally, I want to just go to that back to many of you are commenting on this issue of view corridor. And this is both from downtown to the riverfront, but also actually works in parallel also. So these cartoons just show, is it arches and streets views? Is it seeing landscape at the end? Is it seeing a pier or seeing activity? Is it maybe seeing something like a shopping street, but you seeing other people do things? And finally, is it just seeing the water itself? All of this variety is possible. So finally, let's go into the plans a little bit. And just starting with the diagram today, you know, putting in the labels, and again, this is posted. You know, we've been talking about Met Park, Kids Campus, and then Hogan's Creek East, and then we've just labeled it Hogan's Creek West, which is kind of where, right across from Maxwell House. So let's go to the diagram. So as an overview, we did a number of tests, but this test really shows the 4 seasons plan in place. And then if that project is in place, what are the potential opportunities for great park spaces here? Now, great park spaces also really need a variety of things for people to do in them. You know, there are many for a park to be utilized and well loved. It has to work on ordinary days, and it has to work for special events. So a lot of this is using things we've heard in all these sessions and seeing, are we going to run out of space here? What fits? What kind of ecological variety can we get? So if we go to the next one, and I'll zoom in and talk about that. I want to get back to the transportation issue, including, which I like calling it the mobility issue. How do you feel that you can stop and keep going, or you can hang out? Really, that is clarity of knowing where you are. And this is important. And we really noticed this in various parks across the country in COVID. Places that had a single path were intimidating to people. People avoided them. And what they did is they tended to kind of limit the kinds of access and activity, especially in areas where you wanted to access different things. And there's an opportunity here, really, we see as these important, almost 3 paths. One, supporting Bay Street, having a certain amount of, you know, street-related activity, supporting public transit and mobility options, including bikes, but including buses and circulators. And then access from that point in to what we're calling the resiliency path. And you'll notice this, any new buildings have to be built to flood elevation. We want to be ambitious about protection. So there's an opportunity to create a promontory or resiliency path that allows this topographic experience, allows this to be a park path, but also a path of protection. And then finally, the path you see along the waterfront at the bottom is the kind of the really something that could only happen in a city that has enough public space and enough really potential, which is a esplanade path, almost a kind of raised diagonal pier that could link all the things together that now feel separate. And this has the potential to essentially create almost a combination of shade structures, but allow for water activities below and a view of the riverfront above. So let's go to kind of what the detailed plan looks like. So the Esplanade plan is really illustrating a number of detailed kind of responses to very specific programs that are on the waterfront today, that could be relocated, some new development, sports activities, a lot of trees. We hope very much a lot of trees, but also the edge of the waterfront being more varied. Ecological get downs, coves, the opportunity of Hogan's Creek creating a real natural setting there for a museum experience, great lawns, kind of water play areas for kids. And you can see them all listed below. And then really back to the shipyards, being called shipyards, the fireboat house, the Maritime Museum, the Naval Museum are really important because they're related to ships. And there's an opportunity for other floating programs. I mentioned pools, but one can imagine, didn't I hear gaming rooms, reading rooms, other kinds of floating things could actually create the sort of wharf district that you see on the left that combines very much with creating a experience that's accessible along the water. And so I think it would be great to, I think this is our last slide, right, Maria? Or there might be some zoom ins to talk a little bit about some of these pictures that in a sense, kind of with our size test fits, what they do, like I'm going to start to the right. So you have an opportunity here for lawns and other activities overlooking an amphitheater below, and collectively being able to have very large events. And if that was supported again by this resiliency edge, and we're looking back on the practice field and Jag Stadium, it's really important that the street level esplanades crossing and potentially a green bridge make it easy to get to Met Park. And I think that was a real focus we heard, is that Met Park today obviously looks like it's under construction, but it needs to be in the future extremely accessible, you know, both maybe from a green bridge so you can connect more public facilities like the practice, but also for neighborhoods connecting so they can cut through this area or even park and have a well-treed walk across Bay. And so equally, I think that when I go to the other side, just looking at it, again, sort of this explains the promontory, but also really the idea of different kinds of playgrounds and play features. If we go to now to the other blow up in the next slide, just to kind of focus in a little bit on, you know, the issue of with a big ship and with the creek coming in and potentially a museum, how do we reinforce the keeping buildings and essentially on the edge, but and really making different sizes of building and building related activity relate to this idea of in the future how shade and yet getting to places that are cooler could really enhance the riverfront. And I think that's really where many of the programs that people would like to see on the waterfront can work together. So looking at the next slide, I think what you're looking at, again, the three paths here, how it's really about a necklace of experiences, but without the strings. I think you end up having just, you know, just standalone experiences. And the riverfront that you have all been talking about and linking to is really bringing people together, not just going from one destination to the other. And so this connectivity issue is something that really needs to be developed as part of any design proposal. Okay, if we go to the next. And so again, this illustrates a edge, whether it's kind of almost a farm market or even smaller restaurants and food halls and maybe even a community kitchen, together with a naval museum and the fireboat museum and other kinds of functions that could exist along the edge of the park. And then having, you know, the ship, having potentially other barges or floating activities, And this is coupled with other activities, court spaces, play areas, water features, and other things that we're hoping through the engagement process to get a lot of feedback about. And David Vega Barakowitz, who's my colleague, is there anything that you want to point out in particular that you think I've missed?
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I mean, I would just add that one of the things that came up in the chat is this kind of importance of really ensuring that there's a clear connection to the Hogan's Creek plan and to A. Philip Randolph. And I just can't underscore that enough. You know, these kinds of designs don't happen in isolation, and I think the opportunity to really create a kind of signature outlet of Hogan's Creek that integrates with that design, as well as sort of bringing the ecological principles that are undergirding that design into this project. It's really critical. And the other thing I would just say is that as we've been looking at this design, we are seeing that there is a flexibility in terms of programs. We've not only been looking at recreation on these piers, we've been thinking about spaces for skateboarding, spaces for outdoor pools, places for contemplation or groves or shade structures. So even though, you know, what you're seeing here is can be read as something that's defined, we are, as Claire said, really trying to think about this as a toolkit of elements that we're designing and playing with through this design process. So we're really looking forward to your comments on that as well.
Perhaps one thing to reiterate before going to the larger discussion, and David, you're alluding to this, and I see there's also questions around like DIA involvement and sign-off especially. Quite important to know is that, of course, as Maria mentioned earlier on, this scheme or these schemes were presented in DIA meetings in the last weeks. The plan has not been adopted. There was general enthusiasm for it, which is always good, but very important. That was, of course, only a first step. And we're seeing meetings like the meeting today, the sessions that Groundwork Jacksonville is and will be organizing as like a good way to get more input on these plans, what is happening in these plans. So even though it will be tempting to look at these plans and say, like, oh, why is this there and why is that there? The question is perhaps more like, what could this generally do for the city? And what could be interesting programs that you think may have been overlooked so far?
Great, thank you. So yeah, I do see a lot of questions and comments in the chat around the shipyards. If you want to pose a question, you can use the raise hand function again. We do have a few people that we would like to hear from to just kick us off. And I accidentally pasted in the chat earlier, but Ennis Davis from Modern Cities and with the Jackson, are you online?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Do you want to provide just your thoughts and kind of feedback on the shipyards plans?
Sure. So it's been mentioned in the chat, and I guess David just mentioned it briefly, but I think there's an opportunity here to take the principles that were talked about in the first half of this presentation and apply it to the park and how it meets its outer square. I mean, that's another important principle. They could either make or break a space. So how this space interacts with the areas around it. So in the graphics, Bay Street is almost kind of takes the appearance of a service drive as opposed to a potential great street. A. Philip Randolph is another area. I think if you took a look at Sanborn maps, 19th century maps, you would see there's a historical connection to the waterfront with the historically excluded community of the East Side and East Jacksonville. That has systemically been a barrier created, taking it away from the waterfront. So at one point, that waterfront would have been marsh. And if you look at older maps, that may help guide you on a resiliency plan of what the waterfront should look like and where certain things should go within that space. During the early 20th century, it became more of an industrial waterfront, which created jobs for that neighborhood and really turned A. Philip Randolph into a great street, just as great as Ashley Street was in La Villa. So in the Chipley Circuit days, it was a popular place, lots of mixed use. And you see that on the sports district side today. You've got Intuition Works, you've got the arena, the ballpark. So there should be a stronger direct connectivity between that neighborhood, those uses directly into this space. So I think that's an opportunity that you do have there. So just in closing, I would say, treat Bay Street like the Embarcadero in San Francisco. That's a street where you got an active waterfront, but it's also active with the street parallel with it. And then by the same way, treat A. Philip Randolph like King Street in Alexandria, Virginia, where you have a historic community and a historic thoroughfare that dead ends into a public gateway or public space on the waterfront, Potomac River there.
Thank you so much. David, do you have any comments? No.
No, I was wondering if Claire had any.
No, I mean, I think it's really great to hear that that Philip A. Randolph historically was the street, because, our ambition with the larger Riverfront plan is to really look at those connective streets all the way, not just for one block, right? I think that's what you're implying is that, okay, you can show this here, but really, what's the whole street look like? I love the Embarcadero thing because, for me, even when you look at new plans of the Embarcadero, it's getting even better because it's really going to be a public transit bike and less of a wide car hub. But I think the Embarcadero reference is really interesting.
So I will say, just take a look at Sanborn maps if you haven't already done that.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about because we pulled out all these historic maps, and that's sort of why we already started to look at that. Of course, certain things have happened now already that make these things challenging. But I think what you're telling us all in your comments is don't give up on that. Really, bring some of these great streets back because they were great streets.
Well, I think it's there. There's definitely an opportunity. So
yeah,
I don't know if I consider it a challenge, but I do think there are some easy solutions that could be wrapped into this to bring it out.
Great.
Thank you. Let's see if we have Pedrica Mendez on here. Pedrica is an educator with the Duval Public Schools and a board member of North Riverside CDC.
Yes, Maria, I'm here. Thank you so much for having me. I really like the plan that you have so far, and I do agree with Enos Davis that we definitely need to look at the streets around it and make sure that they're included as well in the plan. The main thing I'm looking at is the fact that it does seem to answer the question. That's my main focus, and I know people of my neighborhood, is that it is inclusive of all social economic levels, and that everyone can have something to do. We have to get in the mindset of realizing that Jacksonville is now a major city, and if we want to attract people with money, we have to have something to attract them, having nice hotels and restaurants, but we still need to have something where the blue collar person can come in and enjoy. Everybody can enjoy, people with families, young people, old people, everybody can come and enjoy the river. Like you said, it is a public space and we all pay taxes, and we should all be able to come and enjoy the river.
I think it's such an important point, and I'm happy you're making it. This also goes back, of course, to the design principles and the social principles earlier on. So the main thing one would want to avoid in any plan, right, that is getting developed, is that it's becoming for only a subset of a city or society generally, So it's incredibly important that this becomes a plan where everybody can find a place. And this also means that, like, for instance, for programs, there needs to be a big variety of really interesting and fun things, ranging from perhaps a job opportunity center on the one side to restaurants on the other side. Like, there could be so much that is happening here. But it's very important that it's accessible to everybody.
Mhm. I agree with you. And I really like the entrepreneurial aspect of it. If we could design it to look more like I've been to the one in Washington, D.C., the Riverfront in Washington, D.C. And yes, if we can have something more like that where everybody can come and take take part, and also be able to, grow individually, then I think that would be wonderful. And I commend you all. I like the plan. I like a lot of the elements that you have in the plan. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna call on, let's see, Dave Engdahl from AIA Jacksonville, and then we'll take whoever has their hand raised after that.
Thanks, Maria. I have a number of points. Some relate to the planning principles and some specific to the shipyards. But in everything we do along the riverfront, it needs to be uniquely Jacksonville. I support doing the investigation of what others did, but we need to look at it through a Jacksonville lens and make it about us, about our community. At best, we create something that everybody else envies and copies and wants to copy. So let's not just copy what others did. Let's do something uniquely Jacksonville. I'd like to second what David Vega and Ennis Davis said about connectivity. That's real important. And in your plan, you did away with the lines that divide parcel by parcel by parcel, because that is not a very good planning principle. I think that we need to connect the riverfront development to Bay Street and into the city, and look, even though there may not be available now, at the parcels that are north of Bay Street as being part of our waterfront. So those are a couple of comments. Hogan's Creek obviously is an extremely important place for activities. And the third point I wanted to make was regarding Metropolitan Park and a grand space that will accommodate a crowd of 10 or 15,000 people, as Metropolitan Park was. The existing Metropolitan Park location seems a bit incompatible with a Four Seasons restaurant next door or hotel next door. And I don't think that the former landing site is a good site for that. So somewhere in the plan, we need to be able to accommodate events that last long into the night on the riverfront.
Dave, thank you, and good to see you. Perhaps I take the first one, and then David or Claire, you want to go to the last one. In terms of uniquely Jacksonville, absolutely. So I hope not to have confused with it. So benchmarking examples you often look at to see what is going on in different places, right? Learn from those, but definitely not copy those things, because good design is always contextual. So you want to be sure that like what gets designed, but also what gets programmed, what activities get developed, are unique to Jacksonville and make sense for Jacksonville. So copy pasting would definitely not be the desired method, but learning from what others have seen as successes and failures is always helpful, of course.
I think that it would be great if David Vega talked a little bit about capacity, but the sort of what I heard in the real, one of the real, because what we even tested and showed is easily 10 or 15,000 people. So it's not a matter of space in Met Park. It is a matter of access. There is one thing that I think what's interesting about a site with the Jaguar Stadium already in the practice field is it already is used to accommodating a lot of people and could be really improved by better public transit, street access, and other forms of access, especially from the water. So potentially Met Park is still, in my opinion, a good location, but any building would have to realize that there would be large events that could go well into the night, and that they would have to invest in window technology and their own planning to accommodate that. I mean, I say that, you know, as a fellow architect, but on the kind of sizing for crowds, I think David Vega, if you don't mind talking a little bit about all the kind of thinking behind that.
Yeah, sure. And I'll say that, you know, we looked at a number of different configurations for Met Park and different kind of programmatic considerations. And this was one that we did think about deeply. There were a few goals in terms of establishing the right design and capacity for at least the version that you saw. We wanted to make sure that we had a space there that could accommodate large crowds, but also a space that could be multifunctional for times when it wasn't being used. And I think that that's one of the most critical things that we've seen waterfronts do successfully, really thinking not just about a big lawn that is really hot and oppressive most of the time, but great for, you know, 10 days a year. We want something that's going to work 365 days a year, and that has a dynamism to it, that it can work for both events, but also at normal times. So with that in mind, we kind of thought about the event space as something that's actually really from a kind of dimension perspective inspired by the hatch shell in Boston as a kind of benchmark, which accommodates about 10,000 people. And so we created a larger space than that with a kind of raised lawn that people could sit on for large concerts and events, looking out onto the water, which isn't kind of how the current site is configured. We also considered some possibilities of integrating some of the existing grading at the site. There's some current trees that are on that site today that work really well. And so there's an opportunity to preserve some of them. But then we also wanted to introduce the concept of actually adding some recreational elements, some new sort of steps, rocks along the water's edge that would create a space for more informal hanging out and performance. And that's something that isn't really in the site today. And so these kind of smaller features, these kind of areas where you can get down to the water, you know, sit on the rocks and watch the sunset, are kind of part of that space with an ethos of not just creating places for the large events, but also places where these kind of informal performances can happen. I think that that's something that we want to continue to kind of draw out as we sort of further look at how that design works and how it relates to the Four Seasons development just to the west.
Thanks. Okay, so let's see. Next up we have Scott. If you want to go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. So a couple things. First thing, I'm definitely a big fan of all the active uses that you have as far as the sports. I think that would be a great draw, especially for young people. My dad was just telling me about in Chicago how they would have a kickball league and they would go out for food and drinks afterwards. So I think that's a great opportunity to kind of create some more year-round activity. But David, kind of to your point, as you were talking about, you know, we want to accommodate for both big events and smaller activities. Have the big events like Florida, Georgia, like Jags games, like the Jumbo Shrimp games, have they been considered in the sense of, you know, have you done scenarios of, you know, what it looks like every day and then what it looks like for big events as far as how the space is used. Because I think that's a really great opportunity to market what downtown could be and what the riverfront could be, especially because it's a growing city. There's a lot of young people and other families that could potentially be attracted to downtown and the riverfront more because they go there for a concert or for a big game. Not that you have to cater specifically to those needs all the time, because I think the 365-day-a-year draw of the riverfront is extremely important. But has that been considered as, potentially marketing the riverfront for the people who come for, maybe once a year, and then they say, oh, I actually really enjoy this. Maybe I should come here more often.
One of the things that we considered in the design was the notion of actually creating a kind of landscape park bridge that would directly connect the stadium district and the practice field to the waterfront. And the intent there was to create a kind of seamless experience between the two spaces. We also, if you see just sort of to the west of that, have been looking at opportunities to really create a kind of clear promenade to the stadium, so that the idea and the kind of language of the park actually goes north. And this is something I think that in our sort of next iterations we need to do with A. Philip Randolph and a number of other pieces along here. I think that programmatically, and this is maybe something that David Vandelier can speak to, there's tremendous amount kind of opportunities to co-program and to kind of create the space for shared programming between the different facilities. And some of that can be, I think, further achieved by really ensuring that the future development plans that happen to the north of Bay Street and what's happening to the south of Bay Street are seen as connected and unified in a very real way. And I think, Dave Engdahl's point of thinking about Bay Street as something that is understood and planned for on both sides is really critical to kind of achieving that sense of connection, both programmatically, but also as a kind of environment that feels like you can really easily come across it, and that those spaces that are kind of part of one and the same thing.
Thanks, David. And Scott, to get back to the other part of your question and comment around like the marketing or the flag, so to say, for the riverfront. I think that is a really important one, but it does need to happen on a variety of levels, right? Some people will respond incredibly well to being drawn to the river, as you say, for big events. Other people would have the opposite reaction. They would probably think like, oh, I want to be sure that there is a quiet place for me that I can go on a Monday afternoon or so. So it needs to be a mix of these different elements that all get used in how the river is being promoted, talked about, and programs. So yeah, it will be key to find that right mix.
Okay. These are all really great concerns that you're all raising. So we have about 8 minutes left, and I want to leave just 2 minutes for us to walk you through the next steps as well. But Michael, I see your hand is raised, and I also saw Nancy Powell's hand up. If you have a comment, Nancy, you can put your hand up again. But Michael, go ahead.
Hey, Michael Blanky. Thanks. You guys have made some great progress here. I really appreciate your hard work on this. I got a couple quick questions, and I apologize. My chat is not working properly, so I was trying to get this through on a chat, but I'll ask the question kind of as a follow-up to Scott's question regarding other events. I know there's been some discussion, and for the past many decades with Florida, Georgia, they required some types of exodus program to get out of the stadium. And I know we're not building a riverfront just for one game a year, but I'm just wondering, has there been any dialogue with them as to some potential alternative opportunities, number one, and number two, along those same lines, has there been some analysis done? You're gonna have a lot of people lodging in the Orthopedic Institute and in the Four Seasons Hotel. And then of course, some people are gonna be living in the Four Seasons condominiums. Has there been any analysis on how to get people in and out of those particular facilities on game day? Because as we all know, that particular area becomes a gridlock for several hours a day during game days in and out of the stadium. So has that been analyzed at this point?
David, I will bounce it over to you, but perhaps the one important thing to note is like the phase that we're currently in is a conceptual space plan, right? To see like what could happen on these sites and like what could technically speaking fit without perhaps going into all the detail yet of a lot of different elements. I think these two things that you're mentioning are incredibly important and will have to be addressed in future phases. But I know, David, you've already been thinking generally about getting in and out of the area and so on.
Yeah, and you know, it's for a plan at this sort of zoomed out resolution. Some of the details aren't always clear, but there is a pretty sophisticated access and parking plan that has been developed for the Four Seasons site, including the orthopedic center. One of the kind of underlying principles that we've been trying to stress in terms of providing that access is really ensuring that where you do provide parking access or where you do provide a street that's allowing somebody to sort of drive or take a bus all the way to the water's edge, that we're really balancing that with the right materials, the right plantings, the right kind of pedestrian amenities to signal to drivers that they're kind of a guest in that space. And so that's definitely something that, since traffic planning tends to be very focused on these sort of peak times or peak flows, that we want to make sure that we're as protective of in some ways as possible. I think that coordinating with relevant entities around how to ensure that these spaces aren't overwhelmed and that there is a kind of transportation management plan in place for game days is absolutely critical, and that's something that is going to require analysis, both in terms of how people are accessing these spaces by vehicle, but also how we're creating other opportunities, whether that's the circulator, whether it's additional buses, whether it's shuttles to peripheral parking garages, planning for scooters or e-bikes and other kind of ways to get to the stadium from downtown. But that's a really great point and definitely something that we need to continue diving deeper into.
Yeah, so I want to just also, some of the feedback we heard about even presenting the shipyard where you're only drawing the shipyard was that, what about the other side, even tonight of Bay Street? Ennis pointed this out, A. Philip Randolph, many other streets, and that whole development of the upland side. How big should blocks be? How do we have really connecting streets? Does imply that the toolkit, I think that we're all hearing, and we feel this way too, that speed tables and the right kind of traffic signals and raised edges for where you wait for the circulator and protected bike lanes are potentially really important ingredients for a successful riverfront plan. So I do want to kind of just point this out at this point, that there is the toolkit of streets, which isn't really being shown here, that I think could be really important in our work going forward to really kind of flesh that out and get the right kind of feedback on it.
Thank you, Claire. Okay, so I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. I think it's approaching dinner time, so we'll have one more comment from Nancy, and then I'll hand it over to David for closing comments. Do want to say that it's really great to see the chat has been so lively, and we haven't been able to, of course, answer all those questions. I see that you've also answered each other's questions, which is great, but we will be diving into the chat following the meeting. But go ahead, Nancy.
Well, thank you. And I'm just going to be quick. I wanted to thank you guys for the depth of the work that you've done and the principles. A lot of those are very aligned, with what we had been working on for the past year, especially just that concept of a riverfront for all. I will say, as far as kind of this plan goes that we see here, it's not really a plan, it's a conceptual space plan. What we liked about it was the kind of the idea that this is one park that goes from Metropolitan Park over here all the way through that path. I love the comment, the path of protection. I love that. As far as making sure that this would be a resilient space, at the riverfront, and to have multiple pathways. I think one of the lessons learned from Metropolitan Park is we never built that river walk to Metropolitan Park. And that was a critical error that we have to correct. And this goes a long way towards that, especially when the buildings are set back towards Bay Street. Some of you all know that we had requested to the DIA that the hotel also get pushed back. We think that would improve the project because it's really critical that Metropolitan Park connect across for this, and then to the earlier points, and then inland to the Emerald Trail, which I understand is going down A. Philip Randolph, which will be great, and other things. So, this is putting the principles in action, but the specifics of kind of what exact features go where, there's a lot of work to be done, right? As far as that goes, we can't get wedded to this. This tennis court is going in this exact spot. And I'm assuming you guys are going to talk a little bit more about that. And it also has to connect with the landing somehow. And I know that's not your area, but the city has to be thinking about what are those features and how do we move forward there. So
absolutely, and thank you, Nancy, and good to see you. So your comment is indeed spot on, right? And going back to earlier comments, like this is a way to see like what could be happening on the site, and would need to run through a variety of phases after this. But this was especially to ensure that what was going to happen in this whole development here would include major focus on people, major focus on green space. And really be a great connector for the city. So quite exciting, and yeah, whether the ping pong table is left or right, that's all to be figured out for sure. In terms of the conversation about the landing, the general river walk along the different parts of the downtown, both north and south sides. That's actually very important. So the ambition on our side is that the principals, once they've run through like inputs in the coming weeks, continued inputs, because it started several weeks ago, would be great if those principles could also be applicable to projects like landing and so on. And of course, we're well aware that the project is moving very quickly. And it will be important to make sure to look at the Riverwalk more generally as like what needs to be happening along the Riverwalk to not only activate it through all types of programs, planned and unplanned, but also to think through like what types of design interventions may be necessary to facilitate that. And in the coming weeks, our focus is shifting towards that. So on the side of Maria and myself, like we're looking at the activation work with WXY starting to get focused on like, okay, what could be those specific design interventions also for other parts? So this also goes back to the earlier comments where it's like, oh, is this only downtown, or is this, could this be applicable in a bigger way? So that's also how we're looking at what we're doing here in the shipyards. Lots of what we're learning here should be applicable fully downtown Riverfront, ideally also be applicable beyond that. Claire, David, anything else to add there? Cool.
I think that's really great. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone in the public meeting understood that part of our work is really the whole river walk in a toolkit. The shipyard was in a way to understand scale, but this process, engagement process, and the lessons we're now zooming back out and looking at the other parts of the Riverwalk, and including many of the principles we talked about with you all today. So looking forward to getting everyone's feedback moving forward on that.
So with that, let's look at the next steps to wrap up the meeting with. It is still July, even though it feels like we're moving very fast through it. What we're doing this month is working through the synthesis of public input and also developing public or program and activation recommendations. We're also picking up the work on the actual other parts of the river walk, as Claire is just alluding to, not necessarily by redesigning it all, that would be a bad idea, but to look at like what types of particular elements could be added to this to improve things. In August, we're working through that more, especially to make sure that by the time September comes around, we have a full activation plan ready for the riverfront, which will then hope to run through input from all of you, stakeholder side, community side, big public meetings like today, and then in order to get it to a wrap up public presentation in October. So lots to do, but yeah, with a lot of excitement and with all of your input, it's of course so incredibly helpful, and yeah, honestly makes it way more interesting to work on this together. In wrapping up, I'd like to thank a few people. You've heard Maria was doing a ton of work on this, so a big thank you from my side to Maria. Also important and quiet in this meeting, but doing a ton of work behind the scenes is the crew at the Jessie duPont Fund, especially Lori, Katie, Melanie, and of course Maria herself. And I really would like to acknowledge and perhaps reiterate, but I think it's an incredible resource to have organizations like the Jessie duPont Fund speaking up, stepping up on topics like this for the city. So it's becoming more and more clear how important this work can and should be for the city. So with that, Maria, let's see if you have any closing comments, but I think we're headed towards the end of the meeting.
No, just, you know, it's just amazing to me that over 100 people logged in. We've still got 60 people going strong. I know dinner is calling. So thank you for the engagement. We will be sending out sort of questions and answers email. Please look for that. And please help us reach some of the underrepresented people in the community. We have a lot of survey responses, but we want them to reflect the demographics of our communities. So especially in the northwest areas, you know, please help us reach those people.
With that, thank you all very much for joining, and bon appetit if you haven't eaten yet. I think many of you have eaten during this meeting. Have a good evening. Thank you.